Sometimes it's hard to think that there are heroes among us that didn't set out to be heroes, but they just end up that way. And Jared Dixon Sheldon is one of my favorite heroes in history. He was born in 1813, died in 1851. He was only 38 years old when he died, but he accomplished so much in that time and is remembered all across Elk Grove. There are so many streets named after him and a school, and he left a legacy that is just hard to match. My name is Roberta Tanner. I am the chairman of the Sloughhouse Pioneer Cemetery. It's the oldest pioneer cemetery in all of Northern California. I've been caretaker of the cemetery for about 14 years now. And my husband is the landscaper. We take tours there and tell stories. And I like to tell the stories of the people buried there. Jared Dixon Sheldon was born to Truman and Polly Dixon Sheldon in Vermont. And he lived there until he was a teenager. One time his father was asked to co-sign on a neighbor's loan. And he never expected to have to pay the loan, but then the neighbor defaulted on it. And so Truman didn't have any money to pay for it. So he sold his two sons, his oldest and Jared, into indentured servitude. And that was how he paid off the loan. He was able to gather money together and finally pay it off. And they got their freedom from that. They didn't have access to public education because they'd been in indentured servitude. And so the two of them worked really hard to learn on their own. And they both became teachers after that. So Jared left Vermont and started traveling out west, kind of. He went to Indiana and Ohio. And he, by the time he was 18, he was earning $16 a month as a school teacher, which we were trying to calculate, and we think that's probably a really good wage for that time. And then by the time he was about 23, he was living in Iowa and was married and teaching school and just having his best life. And then his wife and child died in childbirth. And so he left where he was and changed careers, signed on as a guard on a company that was coming to Santa Fe, and traveled with them for a while. And then when he got to St. Louis, he changed companies, went with a different company to come out to California. So on the way to California, he got really sick, and the company just left him. They decided he was too much of a liability. He probably wasn't going to get better, so why drag him along? And so they left him and his faithful mule in the middle of the desert, wherever. And at one time he ran out of food. He couldn't find anything for days. And he finally decided that he would kill his mule to live on. And then he got down off the mule, and then he looked into the eyes of the mule, and he decided that if he did, both of them would have their bones bleaching in the sun. So he got back on his mule and traveled on and eventually found a coyote. And so he killed that and tried to eat it, and he said that didn't work either. And then he thought, well, we'll just starve together, the two of us, me and my mule. And then a day or so after that, he found some game and killed that and ate it, and they were fine. And he told his children for years afterwards the worst ordeal he ever endured in all his life was trying to eat the coyote meat. It was so rank and terrible. So he finally made his way to Los Angeles. Keep in mind that all of this was Mexican territory. The United States ended pretty much at St. Joseph, Missouri. That was the starting off point for anyone coming out west. And then they would be coming into Mexican territory. He was commissioned to build the first sawmill on the Pacific coast, and was hired by a Mexican man that lived there. The man died halfway through building the mill. And so his wife didn't have any money to pay the debts that he had incurred. And Sheldon had incurred his own debts in construction of the mill. And so the Mexican officials came to him and they said, okay, you have two choices. You can marry this woman and get the mill up and running and pay off the debts that way, or we'll throw you in jail. And Sheldon thought, I've already done indentured servitude once. I'm not doing it again. And so he got on his faithful mule and headed up into the mountains and lived with the Indians up there. So the Indians would, they came to him and they said, we'd like some nice horses like the Mexican garrison has. And he said, okay, I'll tell you when they're sleeping and you just sneak in and take the horses. And so they did. And so then they said, well, we'd really like some saddles to go on these horses. And he said, okay, I'll show you where they keep them. And when they're sleeping, you go in and get. And so they did. And so the Mexican officials decided that they'd never had problems with the Indians until Sheldon disappeared up into the hills. And so they sent a man up with a flag of truce to say, we've had enough. If you promise not to help the Indians anymore, we promise to forgive your debt and let you go. And so he got on his faithful mule and headed out and never went back to LA. So he got to Monterey and started building the customs house for the Mexican government. They had built, the original one was 1813 or something, but it had recently burned and they wanted it bigger. And so they commissioned him to build it for them. So in all of his education that he had self-taught, he taught himself mechanical engineering and carpentry, all those great skills. And that's how he was able to build the sawmill in LA. And then, and so he started building the customs house, and it's still standing today. And they give tours of it and talk about Sheldon there. So he built that, and then they said, well, we don't have any money to pay you, but we'll give you a land grant. You just pick the land, and that's where it is. And there wasn't anything around Monterey because that was the capital of California, Upper California, and everything was already taken. While he was there, one day he looked out into Monterey Bay, and he saw a man out there trying not to drown, and he went out and rescued him and took him to his quarters, gave him food and clothing, and took care of him. That man was William Daylor. He had been the cook on a ship. He'd been on board ship since he was about 10 years old. And Daylor had gotten into an argument with the captain of the ship. He said the captain was always pretty stingy with the supplies, but this time he was planning on leaving port without even restocking the pantry. And so Daylor said, I won't go if you're not going to have good food for me to cook for the sailors. And so the captain said, well, I'm tired of arguing with you. If you make it to shore, good luck. And if not, good riddance. And he made him walk the plank. And so Daylor was in the water when Sheldon saw him and went out and rescued him. They became best friends for the rest of their lives. They were more like brothers than friends. And so Daylor didn't know how to build or anything. So he left Monterey and came up to Sutter's Fort and started working at Sutter's Fort as a bookkeeper and a cook and odd jobs everywhere. So when Sheldon got done, he came up to Sutter's Fort to be with his best friend. One day, Daylor's job was to go out and find some lost horses. And so he went a little bit south and a little bit east and came up through the Cosumnes Valley, which is where we are right now. And he found the horses. They'd all gotten lost together at an Indian rancheria. Very convenient. And so he went back and he got Sheldon because Sheldon knew Indian languages. And so he said, you can negotiate the horses back. And I found the land you should ask for in your land grant. And so both things happened that day. So when I was telling my son-in-law this, he said, oh, how sad for the Indians. They lost their land and the horses all in the same afternoon. And I said, no, that's not quite, because Sheldon was really conscious of the fact that the Indians had lived there forever. And when you were requesting a land grant, you had to draw a little map. It's called a diseño, and they have about 100 of these on file at the archives, Sacramento archives. And the only one that has any designation for the Indian properties is Sheldon's. And he has these two little circles that are the Indian properties, and he said that's theirs forever. Even though I have been given the land, it's theirs. And so he had a reputation for being kind with the Indians and being pretty much a protector. He and Daylor both got that reputation, and they earned that reputation. So he was given 22,000 acres, which is 5 leagues of land. And so he split it in half, gave half of it to Daylor, and he kept the other half. And Daylor had to build them a little adobe hut because you have to start building on the grant immediately. And then Sheldon went off and worked for a year to earn cattle to come back and run on the land. So Sheldon and Daylor were happy, but they were a little bit lonely. In 1846, there were a lot of people that wanted to leave the United States and come out west. And one of the families that wanted to come was led by Thomas Rhodes. He and his wife Elizabeth had 20 children. They had 2 sets of triplets and 3 sets of twins, but it's still a lot of children to have. So they brought 11 of their children with them, and some of them were already married, and so they brought grandchildren and in-laws to their children, and there were 51 people in all in their company that came. They were one of the first families to come over the Sierra Nevada mountains by wagon. And when they got here, they went to Sutter and said, do you have any suggestions? Where should we go? What land isn't taken? And so he sent them down to Galt off Dry Creek. And it just happened to be next door to Sheldon and Daylor's wintering grounds for their cattle. So they met their neighbors, and Sheldon and Daylor started spending a lot of time at the Rhodes family home. And within about 3 months, they were married to Thomas's 2 of his daughters. So the 2 best friends got to be married to 2 sisters who were best friends. So it all worked out very nicely. Catherine was married to Jared Sheldon, and Sarah was married to William Daylor. They were 13 and 15 when they arrived in California. And Sheldon and Daylor were in their 30s. That was a very common thing at that time, all around the Civil War times, because there was no welfare program, and so parents wanted to know that whoever their daughter was marrying could take care of them. So if it was somebody who was a little bit older, then they probably had their lands already established. They had crops or cattle or whatever they were going to do as their living. And they, hopefully they were done sowing any wild oats they might have. So they would stay home and be companions to their daughters. And so it seems odd to us to have a 20-year age gap, but that was a very common thing back then. The Rhodes women went out to do their laundry, and they found this shiny stuff in the water. And so they took it to Sutter to have him test it, and he said, this is real gold, and gather all that you want. Just don't tell anybody, because we want to have a nice empire here. We don't want people who are coming just for the gold. So the Rhodes women just gathered gold for years and years and never told anyone. When they needed money, then the dad, Thomas, would take a long meandering trip to San Francisco, turn in the gold, and then a long meandering trip back so that nobody could follow him. And they just collected the gold. So Sheldon and Daylor decided it was much easier to collect the gold directly from the miners than to collect it themselves. So Daylor built a store that's about a mile from here, up Jackson Highway, so that he could sell supplies to the miners, and Sheldon built the Sloughhouse Inn, where we are. This location is about 18 miles from the Amador mines and about 18 miles from Sutter's Fort, so it's one day's journey each way. So it cut off a lot of time for the miners to come here. The Sloughhouse Inn was built to accommodate travelers going to and from Sutter's Fort and the Amador mines. It became the biggest house in the area, and so the whole area was named for it. There was, at one point, a post office was here. There were other stores that were built close by, and those buildings are still here, but they're vacant now. So backing up, Daylor had this store that they've just restored in the last few years, and so it's now a private home, but it's right on Jackson Highway. He was in town at Sutter's Fort restocking supplies for his store, and he saw a man who was obviously not well, by the riverside, and so he went and put him up in a hotel and took care of him, made sure he was okay. The man had cholera. He'd been on board the ship that was coming up. It was a common way to get out west, besides just coming across the plains, is to get on board a ship and come all the way down around the Horn and then up the other side of the continent, or to just go down to Panama, walk the 20 miles across, and then catch a ship coming up the other way. It was much cheaper if you did that route instead of going all the way down around the Horn, and it saved about 4 months travel time. And so a lot of people did that. So they stopped off in Panama, this ship, to pick up passengers, didn't know that there was a cholera outbreak, and brought several sick people. They dropped off the first sick ones in San Francisco when they realized that they were sick when they got there, and scrubbed down the ship, and then came up to Sacramento. And by the time they got to the Sacramento port, they realized that they still had one very sick person on. So they dumped him off, scrubbed down the ship, and then left. And that man started the cholera outbreak, poor thing. Daylor contracted cholera from his exposure to him, trying to take care of him. And so the doctor said, you have 3 days, go home, put your affairs in order. And so Daylor came out here and wrote a will, and his friends all signed it. And 3 days later, he was dead. So before that time, people would bury them in their backyard or someplace close to where they lived. But when Daylor died, they decided that they needed to have a special spot for him. Catherine had worked with a lot of the Indians. She actually became kind of a nurse to the community and helped a lot of the Indians as well. And so she talked to the Indians and asked if they would let the Sheldons use their crematory, this highest hill in the area, as their cemetery site. And so that was the arrangement. So Daylor was placed there. About a year later, he and Sheldon had been growing crops next to Daylor's store, so that when the miners came to buy mining supplies, they could also buy food. And Davis Ranch still is one of the great places to buy produce in the area. Sheldon had, with all of his mechanical engineering, he had built a dam at the Cosumnes River out by Rancho Murrieta. And it's called an impulse dam. And there were all these canals that were built, and they've seen them on laser photography now. But there are all these canals that have just a very slight decline, that would carry the water all the way out to Davis Ranch. So several miles away. So they'd stop off the water at the Cosumnes and then let it build up. And then when it was high enough, then they'd pull the logs away, and the water would shoot down these canals and water all of the things at Davis Ranch. So there were some men that were trespassing on Sheldon's property out there. They were mining on the property. He didn't mind that. He was okay with it, but they didn't like that he was stopping off the water because they felt it was covering up their mining claims. And mining claims were a big thing back then. So they actually wrote up a thing. There were over 100 men that signed it and took it to court. The judge looked at it and said, you're trespassing on his property, and he should actually be suing you. And so the judge threw it out. So one Sunday, when Jared showed up to stop off the dam, there were about 100 men that met him there. He had a cannon that he had taken from that was left over from the Mexican-American War and had that set up on the dam so that he could take care of anybody that was threatening. Somebody got a twitchy finger, and shots were fired, and at the end of it, Sheldon was dead, and 2 of his friends, and 1 other was wounded, and they never fired a shot at the other men. There were so many men that they cleared out, and no one was ever prosecuted for it. They never knew who to blame for it. But because of that, Sheldon was dead, and so Catherine placed him next to Daylor on the top of the hill, and his two friends that were killed at the same time. So Daylor's grave has been set and marked for the entire time since 1850 when he was buried. There are a lot of people that died, obviously, in California before that time, but they either the cemeteries no longer exist or the markings have gone away, so we don't know exactly where they were. So because of Daylor's cemetery or marking being there, we are noted as the oldest pioneer cemetery in all of Northern California. Catherine had had a baby about 2 weeks before Sheldon died, and so she had her two children. She left the Casumnas house and came and lived in the bachelor pad that Daylor had built, the adobe hut that he had built here, just down the street from here, and lived there. And then about a year after that, she married again, and John Robert Thomas Mahone, and he built her a home next to the cemetery. While Jared was still alive, he must have wanted to give flowers to his wife, and so he sent to England for a heritage rose. It's called the Gold of Ophir. Ophir in the Bible is where Solomon got all of his riches, and it also means a fruitful, productive place, which fit both of the things for this area because you can grow lots and lots of things here. And there's gold in the rivers and streams. So they had to put the rosebush on a boat and send it around the Horn, and then it got to San Francisco and they sent it up to and then they put it on a buggy and sent it out here. And finally, Sheldon was able to give flowers to his wife. But we all know that roses travel as a dead stick looking thing. And so I'm not sure how romantic that was, but it took a lot of effort. So she planted it by their house on the Casumnas, and it bloomed there. When she moved up here, we think she just took a clipping from it and brought that with her. And so when Mahone built her the house on the hill, she planted the rose bush again. And her descendants say she would stand on the back porch of the house and look over the blooming rose bush at the marker for Sheldon and remember him that way.